All right, so back now in Exodus chapter 1. We are going to be looking at Exodus chapter 1 and Exodus chapter 2 today, which might seem like a lot, and it kind of is, but we're going to break it up into scenes. We're going to break it up as if it was almost a play or a movie. We want to see the different scenes, how they interrelate to one another. I think you'll see that it breaks up very naturally into 4 basic scenes with a little epilogue at the end of it to begin the story, because that's where we are today. Last week we did a basic overview of the importance of the book of Exodus, and today now we are setting the stage for really what is one of the most, if not the most, important event in Israel's history. Right? We've said that this event, this great happening, really becomes the event that shapes their thoughts as they move forward with the rest of their experience. It's the story that they look back to. It's the story that they think about constantly, and it shapes not only the Old Testament mindset, but even as we begin in the Gospels, we have a new Exodus event. And so to understand the Exodus is to understand the meta-narrative of the Bible. So we need to understand this story well. Every great story has a beginning, something that causes the movement of the story, the pinch that causes the ouch. What is the pinch that causes the ouch in this account? Obviously, we would say there's probably a few. There's a few pinches that cause this ouch, right? One of them being how the people got to Egypt in the first place. This event would not have happened if they did not first make it to Egypt. And then another pinch could be the treatment of the people over time. So over time, this good place, right? Egypt was a good place, a place of safety, a place of provision. It kept them alive from the great famine in the ancient world. In one sense, it was their place of protection, a kind of paradise. And yet, the treatment that they receive over time becomes worse and worse and worse. And so we could say that's a part of the pinch that causes the Exodus event. All of those are right. But the ultimate reason, the ultimate beginning is not so much their experience of the trouble. It's not so much that they just happen to be in Egypt. Really, it is because God is doing what he said he was going to do. God is the ultimate beginning of this story. He is remembering his covenant promises. If we remember back when we were in Genesis, going through the various parts of Genesis, he's remembering his promises that he made to Abraham to bless him, to be with him, to multiply him, to give him a land, to give him offspring. And he remembers that they are not in the land. And so God begins by bringing them out under the oppression of the Pharaoh, of the Egyptians. So this great story, we need to set the stage as we move forward. So let us look at the first few verses in Exodus chapter 1. We see there a list of names. Right? This should remind us of the list of names that we see in the book of Genesis. Anytime we have these genealogical lists, we know that they're there for a reason. Thank God that this one is fairly short comparatively to some of the other ones, right? And it's basically reminding us of these 12 brothers. These 12 brothers that eventually become 12 tribes. And so we're being reminded that the end of Genesis is not the end of the story. Exodus is telling us right in the beginning that we are continuing where we left off. In fact, there's something missing in our English translation. The first word in Exodus, what is your word, depending on your translation? Mine is these. Is your NIV these too? Okay, but that's not actually how the book begins. If we were reading in Hebrew, we would see that the very first word in this text is and. But that's a little awkward in English. But the very first word is and, meaning that we are actually continuing from where we left off. And these are the names of the sons of Israel. And so this continuation, this bridge that exists, is showing us a few important things. It's catching us up. It wants us to be reminded that Exodus is not a story in a vacuum, but it is a continuation of where we have already been. At the end of Genesis, Egypt is our paradise. It is a very important city in the ancient world, right? They do very well. They have the Nile. The Nile is a great blessing because the Nile provides for all the people. Every year the Nile overflows and it provides for their crops and it provides for them life. And so in the ancient world, if you really wanted to have a sustainable place to be, you needed good, fresh water. And that's exactly what the Nile provided for the people. So Egypt was considered one of the great places in the ancient world to be. They were completely blessed to have this land and to be there. And it became a blessing to ancient Israel, to this family that made their way there. However, something changed. Something ends up going wrong. Now, in truth, it's hard for us and it's hard for scholars to know exactly who the pharaohs were that we're dealing with in some of these texts. Like, we have a good understanding of some of the pharaohs when we study ancient Egypt, but to place them exactly where they were, I mean, people have their guesses. And so one of the guesses we have when we're thinking about Joseph, when Joseph first got to Egypt and he interpreted the dream of the pharaoh, which pharaoh is he talking to? And some would probably say there was actually a group that invaded Egypt. They were from the Canaan region. They came down and they invaded Egypt and they took over and they made themselves in charge. And I forget the name of it off the top of my head. It doesn't matter. It wouldn't mean anything to you anyways. But this group of foreigners then, they came in, they took over, they made themselves in charge. And some would say it was probably one of those pharaohs that was there when Joseph was there. So in one sense, they were invaders taking over. And later on, after Joseph died, there's a big thing in Egyptian history that tells us eventually the Egyptians got rid of those people. There was another battle that happened, got rid of those people, kicked them out, and took over their kingdom once again. And it is possible that the Pharaoh in verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt, was one of those who came to power after they kicked out the invaders. Now, why is that important? It's important. I know it's a little hard to push all that together, but that's important because we want to understand why all of a sudden did they start hating these Israelites? Why did they start to think these Israelites are people we want to start controlling? And it's probably because they had a sense of foreigners are bad, like the people that took us over. And we don't want that to happen again. And so in verse 8, where it says, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, perhaps a better way to translate that who did not know Joseph would be to write something like, who didn't care about Joseph, who didn't care about what Joseph brought, who didn't care that he helped them survive through that great famine. And so over time, maybe a policy was put in place saying, we need to not be friendly with these people. We actually need to be over these people. And they actually give us some reason why. Look at verse 9. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. They keep multiplying. So verse 10, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. And again, here's another translation thing. It's actually a Hebrew idiom. One of the commentators I was reading was saying it's probably better not so much escape from the land, but the Hebrew idiom has to do with being overtaken. So maybe what they're thinking is, if an enemy comes, these Israelites who are great and mighty will join our enemy and they will overtake us like those people that did it years ago. And so in their mind, these people are to be feared, these people are to be hated, these people are to be controlled. Why? Well, because they maybe had a bad past experience. That's not to say that the Israelites even gave them any reason to believe that. Right? They didn't give them any reason to believe that, but perhaps this is what they were coming from. This kind of helps us to understand why. It's not just free labor. Maybe it became that years later, but it's perhaps this idea of taking over. We don't want a foreign nation to come and take over once again. So they have to have a plan to control them, which is our first one. Scene one is the plan to control the people. And their first plan is there in verse 10, to deal shrewdly with them, to treat them harshly, to make a distinction between us and them. And so that's their first thing. Now, the problem for the Egyptians is that the harsher they treat them, the more the people seem to grow. Right? The harsher they treat them, the more they seem to grow. Look at there in verse 12. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. And so, why are they multiplying? Where is this coming from? Obviously, this is exactly what God promised. He was going to multiply them from this man, Abraham, and his wife, Sarah, who were barren, who could not have children. He's grown them amazingly big that the Egyptians are fearful of them. So much so that the more oppression they bring upon them, God keeps being faithful to his promise. I think this is just a good reminder to us that we are to do what God has told us to do regardless of what our circumstances are around us. When the world says, shut your mouth, stop talking about this Jesus guy, you say, no, I can't help it. We must do what God has told us to do. I don't care what you say, because it is more important what God says than what the world around me will say. Regardless, the more problems they had, we could see that God remained faithful. They were oppressed, and yet they spread abroad. So what did they do? Verse 13, well, let's up the ante. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. So the first thing was to oppress them, in one sense, as separation, to treat them poorly. The second plan, though, was to, okay, fine, we're going to make you do what we want you to do. Now, the Israelites, we know this as they were coming into Egypt, that their main job, what they had passed down, were to be shepherds, right? They took care of the animals. That was how they got their money. That is how they provided for their families. And the Egyptians said, no, you're not going to do that anymore. You're going to do what we want you to do. So in one sense, they're also trying to take away their identity. Take away what they've done from generation to generation. You are going to now work in the way that we want you to. So first step is you make them seem different. You separate yourself from them. You treat them unkindly. Second step is you start taking away their identity. Taking away what they've done from generation to generation. So now they're going to make them work as slaves. They give them, verse 14, they make their lives bitter. They give them hard service, primarily in mortar and in brick. So they have them start to build cities and store cities, and it is a very difficult task. But again, the more they are ruthless to them, God still is with them. So they have to come up with a new plan, which is scene 2. Scene 2 is plan B, infanticide. So what are they going to do? Verse 15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. So how are we going to control these people? How are we going to get their numbers down? How are we going to make them ineffective? Let us kill their children. Let us kill their children. How do you weaken a people? How do you dishearten a people? How do you destroy a people? You destroy their children. And isn't that the same thing today? How do you do that? You destroy a people. In one sense, I didn't plan on that until after I wrote it down. Plan B, infanticide. And that's what we have now. We have our Plan B pills. Oh, you accidentally had a baby? Well, here's a pill you can take to kill your baby. How do you weaken a people? Well, we've already said, I can't remember, we were talking about it before, that birth rates are dramatically going down in many of so-called progressive cultures, progressive parts of the world. We're so smart. Kids, they just get in the way. You know, one way to start to lose control over any sense of culture or anything else is to be outbirthed. You know who keeps having babies more and more and more? Islamic communities. You know, one way they're going to take over different areas just by having babies. Right? That's one way. We've made it seem in our culture that babies are just a burden. Burden, something to get rid of. Something that just brings you down, that keeps you from living your own life, from enjoying your own life. And so what do? We kill them. We make it seem like it's a good idea. Let's kill them. It's your choice to kill them. I want you to notice that in the Bible we see this multiple times. Right? Multiple times where the idea of sacrificing children, killing children, this has always been one of the main devices of the enemy to bring down God's people. Killing children. And yet that device has not changed, and we just become more and more okay with it. So he comes to these midwives and says, destroy these children. Destroy these children. Now, there's an interesting thing here. I read this over and over again, and I actually looked it up this morning just because I had a thought. Are these midwives, are they themselves part of the Hebrew community? Or are these Egyptian ladies who then work? I mean, they couldn't just be two of them for all of the people of Israel. That wouldn't be enough. Some said that maybe they're kind of the leaders of a group that work with this, but maybe are they Egyptian or are they Hebrew? If you just read it there and it says the Hebrew women, Hebrew midwives, it could seem like that is describing who they are. However, it's possible to actually say that they are the midwives of the Hebrews or to the Hebrews, which I think actually tends to make more sense with the movement of the account, because if Pharaoh came to Hebrew women, and these are their community, why would he think that they were going to kill people in their own community? Instead, I think it probably is a better thing to see that they are midwives to the Hebrews or of the Hebrews, but they are Egyptian. And they decide, no, we can't. We are fearing God. How can we do this thing and destroy these children? How can we do this thing? All right, we are not going to fall into that trajectory, which is an important thing. I mean, what should this remind us of? Well, let's get to our New Testament, right? What happened when Jesus was born, when these magi, these wise men came and they said a king has been born? What did Herod the Great want to do? Let's kill all the young boys. Let's get rid of them. Right? So this sense of destroying children once again. All right, even in history, Sam's been learning about Rome recently in school, right? And what was one of the downfalls of Rome? I've heard you say it over and over again. Lack of respect for human life. And what was one way that was seen? That dealt with babies. Come on, did you already do your test, or do you have your test coming up? Okay, then you should know it, or you just dropped all the information now. You don't need it anymore. So lack of respect for human life. What would happen if maybe they wanted a boy, but instead they had a girl? How would they do it? They just, okay, we got a girl. Well, we don't want a girl. We're going to walk out to the woods. We're going to put the baby in the woods and we're going to walk away. Right? Or if it was born and maybe it had some kind of deformity and they didn't like that. So what are we going to do? We're just going to take it. We'll throw it off a cliff or something. Right? They know respect for human life. They know care. You know what the early Christians would do? They would go out into the woods. They'd find these babies and they'd adopt them for their own. Why? Well, there's a culture of death and there's a culture of life. And unfortunately, we still live where there is a major culture of death all around us. You know, one of the things that we're fighting nowadays, that's going to come more and more to the U.S., it's really bad in parts of Europe right now, is a kind of assisted suicide where you can, it's not because of even health anymore. It's if I feel like, my life isn't going the way I want it, or I'm having even mental health issues or whatever else. In some countries, it's as low as 16. You can decide that you want to go to the doctor to die. What? That should be heartbreaking to us. Right? That's horrible. This is the way the enemy has always worked. Nothing has changed. But there's always a light. There's always a bright light, and God has always worked through those who have feared him, who have sought after him, and these midwives are an example of that. They cannot kill these children. They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. And because of that, because they said, we are not going to do this, look at verse 20. So God dealt well with the midwives, and people multiplied and grew very strong. He gave them families. He blessed them because they feared him. And I think this is an important clue that we're going to see come up a little bit later, lest we think that God is just merely showing favoritism to these Israelite people and hating on the Egyptians. We have to remember something that I don't think often comes out in the cartoon. There were people that were not Israelites who joined with them in the Exodus. Meaning that what God said to Abraham, that he would be a blessing to the whole world, is already coming to pass. And I believe these midwives joined with the people of God. Later on, we're going to see that, as it says that the Israelites, as well as others, are going to walk through the Red Sea. So when we think of some of the hard things, right, like the death of the firstborn, that's a hard plague. That's the last plague for a reason. But the truth is, God didn't just say, hey, I'm going to tell you a secret. Do this so that your firstborn will live. No, Moses took that news and he proclaimed it. He took it to Pharaoh. He proclaimed it. And it wasn't just the Israelites who could do the Passover and have the destroyer pass over them by taking the blood of the lamb. Anyone who followed those instructions would have been preserved. And I believe that there were some Egyptians who followed those instructions. I believe there are clues in the text that tell us that. God's grace is for all people everywhere. If we are willing to fear God, humble ourselves before him, that he may lift us up. So plan B did not go the way they thought, right? The midwives did not do, so what does he do? Fine, verse 22, last verse in chapter 1. The Pharaoh commanded all his people, fine, here's what you can do. Every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. We're going to take this a step further. We're not going to depend upon the midwives. We're just going to go through and throw them into the water. Again, this is revealing to us the heart of this Pharaoh. This is not a good thing. Scene 3, now we're going to zoom in this situation. Scene 3 is now there's a baby in a water. A very famous scene. Let's read these 10 verses together in chapter 2. It says, now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. Then his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant women, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. He became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So again, a very familiar scene perhaps, but there's some interesting things in here that I think we want to see how God is working. God is not mentioned in this scene, and yet I think we see the clear hand of his providence in this moment. So we see that this son, this baby Moses, is born, and because this mother loved her son as you would expect, she hid him as long as she could. Whenever they were coming around to take a child and to throw him to his death into the Nile, she hid him. But as you know, it's very hard to hide a young child after a while with their cries and their noises. And so in verse 3, she makes a basket to put him in the basket, to put him in the river. Now, when I'm going through this passage with students, I ask this question because I think it's an interesting one, is why do you think that that was what she decided to do? Why put him in this basket in the river? And there's a few thoughts we could have here. Well, maybe they saw the daughter of Pharaoh there, and maybe they were hoping that she would take pity on this situation. That's a possibility. Maybe they knew that that's where she goes. But is it also possible that she knew that there was nothing that they could do? And so she could not bear to watch her son being thrown into the river and drown. And so she just decided, we're going to send him down the river. I can't see it. That's a possibility as well. Maybe it was just complete, there's nothing we can do now, but I can't bear to watch what is going to happen. Whatever the reason, there's a key in here, I think, that shows us that God is still involved in this situation. The word for basket here, and if that's what your translation says, you might have a footnote. My Bible actually doesn't right here. But it actually is the very same word that is used in Genesis chapter 6 for ark. It is the same exact word, to build an ark. The ark, in one sense, is a giant basket, I guess you could say. And so I think we're given a clue that in this basket, in this little mini ark, that God is going to preserve this child for a purpose, in the same way that he preserved Noah and his family for a purpose. So he's in this basket. He's going down a river. The mom, she can't bear to watch this, but his curious sister comes and stands at a distance. What is going to happen to him? We don't know what's going to happen. Is he going to keep floating for a long time? Is he going to be found? Is he going to be taken? What's going to happen? And then it tells us in verse 5, the daughter of Pharaoh comes down to bathe at the river. Again, is that just happenstance? Is that just by chance that she came in that moment? Was there some kind of schedule that was kept? Whatever it may be, she comes down. She happens, quote unquote, to see this basket, and she looks inside. She identifies him right away. She can see this is a Hebrew child. This is one of the Israelites. But instead of saying, I know the rule for the Israelites, good old dad has told us, if we find an Israelite baby boy, it must be destroyed. We know the heart of the pharaohs. However, for one reason or another, she takes pity upon this child. Is this God softening her heart to the situation? Is this God giving grace in this situation? I like to think so. So she takes pity on this child. Instead of just throwing him in the river, she decides to take care of him. Verse 7 says, then his sister, Moses' sister, comes and says, shall I go and call you a nurse? You need a wet nurse to take care of this baby. She says, okay, good, go get a wet nurse for me. So she goes in to get the child's mom. Listen what Pharaoh's daughter says in verse 9. Take this child away, nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. So not only is Moses' life spared, he gets to go back to his family being taken care of by his own mother, and now she's going to get paid for it. This is God's providence. Right? This is God's providence. Look how he worked in such a horrible circumstance, and yet behind the scenes was pulling all things together. When the child grew, verse 10, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, which sounds like to draw out of the water. So it's kind of a Hebrew name as well as an Egyptian name at the same time. And we learn in the book of Acts that as he grew, Moses then, he had a recognition that he was a Hebrew, but he had the training as an Egyptian. He had all the benefits of being an Egyptian, having the best schooling, the best understanding, the best library in the ancient world. And so he had those benefits. All, what we're going to say, is preparatory for what is to come. There's something in these first two chapters that is not only setting the scene to the problem, but it's showing us how God is preparing Moses in advance to do what he will do a lot later. And we'll see that one more time in a second. So scene 4. Moses makes a choice. Verse 11, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? He answered, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came and drew water and filled their troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon today? They said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock. He said to his daughters, then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So in verse 11, we're seeing something. Moses is now grown up. Moses is now a grown man. In fact, one thing that we often say is that the book of Exodus is broken up into these big chunks of time, right? Where we have about these, 40-year chunks or 20-year chunks? I'm trying to think. Yeah, it's 40-year chunks. So because he spends about 40 years out there as a shepherd, 40 years in Egypt. So it's about the first 40 years of his life that we see here in these first 2 chapters. He's not going to come back to Egypt until he's an old man. But as he's then grown up now, he also recognizes the problems that are going on with his own people. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 11, it says this, Hebrews 11, 24 to 26, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So as Moses looks around at his situation, yes, he identifies himself as an Egyptian. In fact, remember, that's how the ladies out in Midian identified him. He's an Egyptian. So he looks like an Egyptian. He sounds like an Egyptian. He is cultured as an Egyptian. There's also something in his heart that says, but these also are my people. I care about these people. And so Moses makes a choice to identify with his Hebrew background. However, he is young and immature at this point because when he wants to fight for his people, perhaps he goes about doing it the wrong way. And this always catches students by surprise when they see what he does. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew in verse 11. So what does he do in verse 12? Well, he looks around, he makes sure that nobody is looking, and he goes and he attacks that Egyptian man, and he kills him. And he tries to hide his body in the sand. So in one sense, we would say that's a good desire to want to protect someone, to protect your people, but he went about it the wrong way. He wasn't ready to do what God was going to use him to do, although that desire we can see was already in him to free his people, to help his people. The problem is when we try to do things our own way and not God's way, we run into problems. And so instead of doing it God's way, he doesn't know what God's way is right now. He takes matters into his own hands. A man's life is lost. He thinks it's a secret. The secret has gotten out, and now he is a wanted man. What is he going to do? He runs away. So it could end this way. Moses leaves Egypt. That's his first exodus. He's gone. But he leaves as a criminal. Right? He leaves as somebody who's trying to do things his own way, and it has not turned out for the good. As he is out there, though, in Midian, it's interesting because he comes across this man, Reuel, which, again, what does that mean? I think it means friend of God. Does yours have a note that says that in verse 18? Friend of God? Is that what that means? No, she does, though. Friend of God. See, I'm good. Friend of God. He goes out there. He meets this man. He's also named Jethro. We'll see later on. But he meets this man who's a priest. Now, he's a priest in the sense of the patriarchs. So remember, there are other people who worship the one true God. And he is in that kind of line of people that do that, similar to the priest that the king priest Melchizedek that Abraham runs into. And so he meets one who is a follower of God, and he's going to spend the next 40 years of his life starting his family, learning about the desert of Midian, learning about God as much as he possibly can. And what's interesting is this: he's not going to come back to Egypt for 40 years as an old man, but all this stuff that has happened to him is preparing him for what he's about to do. In his Egyptian training, he understands how Egypt works. He understands the policies of Egypt and how to engage with the leadership of Egypt. But in his 40 years in the land of Midian, why is that important? Well, now he's going to know how to survive in the desert that he's going to be leading other people through for 40 more years later. He understands what it's like to be out there, to be a wanderer, to be a nomad. And it is only at the culmination of all of that, towards the very end of his life, in his 80s, that God is going to say, now is the time I'm going to use you. Now is the time. Isn't it strange that that's something that happens quite a bit in the Bible? Abraham was 75 when God came to him and said, you're going to follow me. Sometimes we think it's too late. What could God do with me? Well, how has God been preparing you for a long time for what you don't even know yet? In what ways is God going to use us today? We can't get to the mindset, God is not going to use me, I'm too old, I'm done. No. There is so much preparation that goes into life in ways that we can't even possibly understand. And as he's out there, God is preparing him to do great and mighty things. Let's end with our epilogue. Verse 23, during those many days, the king of Egypt died. So the one that wanted him dead because of what he did. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God knew it is time. This epilogue, this ending here, really just reminds us of where we started. It takes us back to where we started. Why is God going to act? Because he promised that he would. Verse 23 is always interesting to me, and it seems like maybe I might be a little bit wrong with this, but maybe there's some nuance here, because it says the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. And one of my questions is, in their cry, is that a cry directed to the one true God? Or is that just a general cry? Because remember, they kind of lose sight of who God is. And if it is not necessarily directed to God, it is, however, a reminder. Because it says their cry came up to God. God still hears. But I think that would be grace as well. They're crying out, this is hard, this is bad, this is not the way that life should be. Not necessarily directing that to God, and yet God hears, he cares, and he does what he's going to do. Because he promised their ancestors that he would. Not because they are good, but because he is good. He hears and he works for his purposes. And this to me is the amazement of the gospel itself. We can so get distracted, as we all do at times, by our outward problems. They're distracted. I mean, we would say, let's give them a little bit of a break. Obviously, things are going very bad in their whole situation. Slavery is bad. But ultimately, remember, what is God going to do? Where's the first location they need to be? They need to know who their God is. They need to be in good relationship with him first. This covenant is a relationship between them. And the gospel is a reminder of that for us. Yes, life can be hard. Yes, life can be a burden. But even in our burdens, God is preparing us for something important. In Moses' burdens, in the hardships that he faces, in the dumb choices that he makes, God is preparing him for important purposes. So the gospel tells us this: stop trying to find our hope in bettering our situation. Find our hope in knowing God. That while we were broken and dead in our sins, the amazing thing of the gospel is that Jesus died on behalf of sinners so that we can first and foremost know God, be in right relationship with God, and then that perspective changes the way that we see our life around us. Is that your hope? Have you placed your hope in Christ alone? Do you have hope that regardless of your experiences, of your circumstances, that you know God and that you want to live your life in a way that glorifies him? We're going to see Moses struggles. He's not a comic book hero. He's a regular guy. But God takes regular guys, even like Moses, and uses them for mighty ways, and he even does that today. That is the God that we serve. That is the God who delivers. That is the God of the Exodus. That is the God of the gospel. And we have the wonderful privilege to love, to worship, and to serve him. Let's pray.